Hello, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I think my last time I was in this building was like a rave. Has anybody been to like an EDM show here before? Raise your hand. Okay, we have a couple. Okay, yeah. We probably were the same one. So.
We were talking about that before.
Oh, really?
I think a lot of folks on our team have been here mostly for that.
I was like, this is a very familiar venue. So, okay.
I was doing some research on you before, looking at your tweets. You're a prolific tweeter. How do you do it?
It's funny. Prolific tweeter is sort of one of these like backhanded compliments.
No, it's a full-on compliment.
Okay. It's like, do you want to be a prolific tweeter? I don't know. I basically just tweet what we're running into at Box and what we're seeing when we're building agents and working in AI. What I'm hearing from customers and hearing from the market and kind of whatever's in the zeitgeist that sort of resonates. So it's kind of unfortunately, it's like a very boring framework. It's just like, a couple times a day, whatever I think is happening in the world.
It's a couple times a day, but it's a bunch of paragraphs, and it's all spot on, like very in tune with what's going on in the ecosystem. I'm in awe.
Thank you. I mean, I think most people know how to write, so you can all try this at home. So just try and type a couple paragraphs and just see what happens. It's so funny because like I definitely got like a C+ probably in English in high school. So like, but like everybody thinks that I like write a lot, and I was like, I don't know. This is like you can either write an email or write a tweet. So might as well write a tweet. So.
Do you use AI for your tweets at all? Okay.
No.
All right. Well, I think you're definitely one of the most knowledgeable.
And some of my tweets make it very obvious because I'll look at it later and be like, oh my God, there's actually like up to 9 mistakes in this tweet between grammar and spelling. So it's definitely like proof of human work.
Yeah, you almost have to add that in on purpose so people know it's not AI.
Yep. In this case, it happens fully organically. So.
I think you're one of the smartest people in terms of what it takes for enterprises to actually adopt AI. And I imagine this is because you work with a number of them daily. What advice would you have for enterprises who are thinking about this? I imagine everyone's thinking about this.
Yeah, and I think this is, I mean, just to point back to even the first question, I'm super lucky because this has been true of basically since the founding of the company. You guys, live, I think, the same world. Probably many folks live in this world as well. We get to be in the tech industry in Silicon Valley, sort of seeing the breakthroughs of what's happening in AI today. But previously, it was cloud computing initially, and our whole business model. You could almost net the core business model that we had when we started Box, which was there's these breakthroughs happening in tech. In this case, it was the early days of cloud and cloud infrastructure and all of that. But to translate that to the regular knowledge worker or a regular enterprise, there has to be some bridge. You have to have simple interfaces. They have to be usable by end users. There's got to be a way to package up this infrastructure in a way that makes sense for use cases. And I think AI, we're seeing the same thing, which is we have these incredible breakthroughs happening in AI. Model progress is absolutely insane. Infrastructure and framework and the kind of surrounding scaffolding is kind of progressing at an incredible rate. But most enterprises in the world have to have some kind of bridge of how do I get access to this in a way that's relevant to my use cases and to my organization. So I get to spend a lot of time with especially large enterprises, but businesses of all sizes across industries, and we get to kind of see like what's happening in their organizations as they go and adopt AI and as they try and bring all this amazing technology to their organization. I think it's probably what everybody here is experiencing, whether you're building a product for the enterprise or you're in an enterprise yourself. And maybe it can be netted out to we have this insane progress we're seeing in things like AI coding in particular. We're all using agents for developing code, and we all see every day the full potential of what happens when an agent can kind of run loose on a large task and a large project. And then we look at the rest of knowledge work and marketing and sales and finance and research, and the big question is, can we get those similar gains in all of those other parts of the organization, in these business processes that are in domain specific or industry specific areas? And that's the main question that I think is on the mind of every single enterprise, right? We all as technologists are using this in our daily lives. Our colleagues that are maybe not in tech are using it in their daily lives, but more for a chat sort of basic interaction. So the big question is when and how do we get these full agentic workflows deployed across the rest of knowledge work? That's kind of the topic that takes up the mind share of, I think, most enterprises today. And again, some of it is then building this internally, figuring out how to do that. Some of it is, working with partners and vendors and providers to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, on that, like, what is the answer to that question? What is working?
I purposely left it rhetorical because I think we're figuring it out. But the tricky thing is, and I don't know how much this will resonate or not, because I think being in tech, so many people here, it's like you have to kind of step out for a second and think about this. Like when you think about the full amazing power of AI coding agents, it has sort of like every great property going for it, right? The models themselves are hyper trained on code because that's plentiful content type on the internet. The work itself is verifiable, so you kind of know if the code worked, and so that helps both in the RL process and the actual kind of when you're using the agent to do some work. The users are hyper technical by definition, and so like when the agent does something and it goes wrong, you're like, you know how to fix it. Or if it says I need access to a data source, you generally have the ability to get the right MCP server involved in that workflow. You know that like when you're in a coding agent and it's like, hey, I need to download this CLI from this vendor in this package, you have the wherewithal to say yes or no based on that situation. I was, as a brief aside, my dad has gotten into coding, but he's not historically a coder. He is kind of good at Excel and data science stuff. And I was just watching him use Claude Code, and he was just like, yes, download that package, and yes, and like, for sure, his computer now is full of malware. Like, there's just no chance. Every NPM attack we've seen in the past like 3 days, like he's got every one of those. So, but like that's what. And sorry, Dad, wherever you are, but like, this is what a lot of teams adjacent to engineers are going to experience. And then imagine if you're even more adjacent and you're like just in you're in marketing and you're in sales, all of that kind of technical complexity. So that's a bunch of issue. And then you actually have a kind of a pesky problem that is so boring to talk about, but it's just so real. When you're an engineer, you generally via the code base have access to most of the data and the context to work within for whatever you're working on. And like permission structures on code bases, generally are fairly wide open because you just need access to the code base to do whatever you're doing. In knowledge work, that's just not the case. Like every single individual and every single team within an enterprise has a different permutations of what data they can access. And so by definition, agents also have those same permutations, which just multiplies the complexity of when an agent goes and does a task. So think about all those things that we just said, right? So the work is not as verifiable as code. The models are still working on getting better at these non-coding domain tasks. The users are not as technical, so kind of getting their the full universe of things they need to plug in to make these agents work is obviously harder. And they don't have access to all the data they need often to do the work that they need. And so agents, again, inherit that same level of lack of access, which means that, as a knowledge worker, we can just go around and we can go and say, hey, Sally, can you give me access to that thing? But an agent doesn't have that same ability to navigate that complex paradigm of like, well, what does an agent do when it runs into a limit of what it has access to? So this is the gap. And so then the question is, how are we all going to, as an industry and within each industry, going to bridge that gap? And so I think you're starting to see some of the makings of examples of where this might work. So first of all, like highly domain and vertical specific agent startups are emerging. And that's one great thing, because now you can basically say, you know what, we can deliver this in a really kind of purpose-built way. So we can dramatically reduce all of the issues on how do you get the context to the agent? Well, we know the domain, so we're already have a leg up on that. How do you get the right data to the agent? Well, here are the set of MCP connectors that we're already going to work with. There's usually some version of like a forward deployed engineer in that workflow. So already you have people that are going to be like wired to that vertical that can help support that. So I think on the startup side, I think this creates an incredible opportunity if you're doing domain and vertical specific, agentic work. And then on the enterprise side, it's another sort of advantage, which is you understand your enterprise better than any outside vendor. So it also creates an opportunity for how do you go and bridge these agents and this technology into your organization. And that's another set of, I think, roles and interesting opportunities that we're starting to see emerge, which is like, okay, does your technology team have like an AI agent sort of internal forward deployed engineer, and how are they setting these things up? So that's a little bit of like the early things that we're seeing, but I think we have to be in for many years of diffusion of this technology, and we're going to have this huge cognitive dissonance between the again extreme capability of AI coding agents that just are continuing to go hyperbolic versus what we're going to do in the rest of knowledge work because of all of those issues that I mentioned. And we're just going to be in for years and years of deployment and change management and adoption, and that's I think what we all have to kind of collectively sign up for. And oh, by the way, as just a brief asterisk, it's also why the doomers are generally going to be wrong on the takeoff because of the sort of rate of diffusion of how this is going to actually enter organizations.
How are you guys at Box thinking of tackling that with Box Agent? So that seems to me to be horizontal, but you're already building upon a pretty solid data layer. And so how are you guys thinking about that, and how are you thinking about bridging the gap?
Yeah, so I think we're a little bit in this quasi-interesting territory because we're horizontal, so we don't have the level of domain specifics of insurance and banking and legal, et cetera. The thing that we have domain understanding on is enterprise content at a horizontal level, and how to work with things like file systems, and how to handle all the ways that agents and models need to understand working with our file system and working with enterprise content, and how do you create a pipeline of making sure your data is sort of ready for agents in a secure way, in a well-governed way, with the right access controls and the right sort of security and governance on that. And so we do a lot of things even well before we even think about AI to get enterprise content or unstructured data ready for AI. So we have a whole document conversion pipeline that turns your content into a variety of file formats that agents work well with. We do a lot in the kind of security and access controls area. So that's a lot of the kind of core plumbing. And then with the Box Agent, its job is to be an expert at working with enterprise content, and then it needs obviously the context of that workflow. So it's going to need either skills or custom agent, kind of knowledge, which is the form of like, what is your business process? What are you trying to automate? And that looks like, I think, anybody else's agent that you'd go build, or we'll plug into a broader agent. So, via our MCP server, we'll plug into a Harvey or a Claude, for legal, and then that will obviously take on the domain-specific sort of understanding.
You had a lot of this core plumbing around permissions and governance before agents. Have you seen that it's changed because of agents?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of things that we've benefited from. Just maybe sometimes we got lucky, like we made an architectural decision 10 years ago that we obviously made it for people, but we equally get the same kind of gains within a world of agents. We've been most companies, you all have lots of these like deeply religious battles on things like, which JavaScript framework to go with, and which database to use. And that's obviously like, the classic engineering battle that would happen. We had years and years of those same kind of incredibly intense battles on things like, how do you design a file system, and how should the permissions architecture work? And so we benefited from incredibly intense sort of processes and ways of making decisions to ensure that we had the most amount of flexibility, again, more for people use cases, sometimes for application use cases, but now we're benefiting from the fact that agents get all of those benefits as well. So within Box, as an example, there's not two ways you can store files. There's only one way you can store files. There's only one canonical ID for every object in the system. There's only one governance model. So we versus many of our kind of maybe legacy competitors where there's like 3 different ways that data could show up in the system. It's a single file system. It's a single governance model, a single permissions architecture. So agents get the benefit of all of that. Then there's some areas where we've realized, we probably do have to evolve the platform. Our search engine, needs to take in different signals because the agent can now consume 100 times the search results as a human. So like if it can consume 100 times the search results as a person, then you might need to rank things differently, or maybe ranking is less important than just context in the search results, because then the agent can do its own ranking. So we've had to do a bunch of tweaks to our search engine as one example. We've had to do a bunch of things where in our document pipeline we have to convert data in an agent-ready format. So we have an API now that will take basically any content type and turn it into Markdown. So some things that just make it so our agent or any external agent can work with this data much better.
You mentioned before that you have an agent inside of Box, and then you expose that via MCP, and I think you guys also have just regular search endpoints over MCP as well.
Yep.
As you guys think about the company strategy, do you have a strong opinion of how much you want people to be consuming Box AI in the Box AI interface versus via MCP?
We have sort of what we wish would happen, and then we're also realists. So, and we by being in enterprise software, anybody in enterprise software, you kind of know that ultimately the customer is going to win. There's very few companies that can kind of hold out from overall customer trends and whatever that kind of mega trend is. So I think, and this is probably something that every single one of the software players has to face it right now, which is, when does your agentic experience show up versus when are you headless? And even headless takes on two forms, because it could be our AI being headless, or it could just be our regular APIs being headless. And so that has its own kind of set of dimensions to it. But I think the way that we kind of think about it is we have to get insanely good in our harness at things where working with content is the most important thing, where being kind of token efficient is the most important thing, where having the right choice of models is the most important thing. We've got to be the best at that when it deals with enterprise content. So we have, for instance, an agent that just does document extraction. And we'd like to think that agent doing document extraction is going to beat any kind of horizontal system that you could send that problem to, because we're just hyper-wired to that. We have our own evals for that. We only work on that problem. Conversely, if you're just working with Claude Cowork or some other, or ChatGPT, and you want to have content show up inside of that experience, then we know that that's going to be 100% headless, and that'll be really driven by the customer's sort of interaction and whatever they decide to roll out to their organization. And we are completely indifferent, sort of philosophically, to either of those approaches that the customer wants to do. I think that's what we all are going to have to sign up for if you're building software. Is you should just expect that you should create a world-class experience within your product, and you should create world-class APIs that any external system can interact with. And then by volume, it might be that by volume of your system usage, it's mostly going to be headless. But for people, kind of doing a bunch of work, it will often be that they'll be in your interface or your agent for that.
Yeah, I think we saw Salesforce the other week or the other month expose all of their APIs via headless. So I think that's definitely.
And that was actually a pretty big symbolic moment. So you have basically the world's largest SaaS company, fully endorsing that headless is the future. I've already used their headless MCP a ton of times for ways that previously, interestingly, and this is the bull case for all of this, I've used their MCP server now for tasks that were both more complex and much higher volume than what I ever would have had an internal analyst go do. And this is sort of the Jevons paradox kind of whole thing of this, which is there's lots of things where when you're inside of a workplace and you kind of know, hey, that's a person that's going to have to go spend 5 hours on this project or 3 hours on this project. Is that really the most important thing for them to go do versus everything else that they're going to work on? Whereas an agent, I don't care other than the token costs. So I give tasks to a variety of agents all the time that I wouldn't have asked a person to do, but it ends up doing then useful work for me. And so Salesforce MCP server is a great example where I'll just hand off a thing of some market research, and it'll go and do maybe 20 minutes of work that would have been the equivalent of hours of human work that I just absolutely would not have ever had somebody else go and do. And that's the example of now the new surplus of what we're going to start to see is you'll just use these systems 10x or 100x more depending on how valuable that data is or where it shows up as kind of being value accretive in the organization.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that, because I think there is a bunch of fear around being headless and getting disintermediated or having other people drive it, but it seems like it's just driving more usage.
I think there's some areas where I can appreciate the fear. I like there's not a perfect quadrant. Maybe you guys could publish one so we could all know what's going to happen. But there's probably something of is this type of data does it have sort of a bunch of just unsaturated use cases in the enterprise? If that data could be unleashed at for everything, how much more would it get used Versus there are some data sources where no, like even if you could throw any amount of compute at that, I just don't need to do more with that information. And I think that's we just haven't run in yet to like how do we parse what types of systems could you really use a ton more versus which ones are kind of already meeting their set of needs with, and that will help us, I think, kind of figure out what things will headless be a huge opportunity for versus maybe just neutral.
You talked a little bit about your harness for kind of like knowledge work and document intelligence. We also talked about coding agents and how those are taking off pretty rapidly. How much do you look at like coding agent harnesses for inspiration around what your harness should look like, and how similar do you think they'll end up being in the long term?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and what you guys are doing with Deep Agent is sort of, to me, like right on point, because if you think about it, and I was late to this conclusion, and I've only sort of seen the light maybe in the past 6 months on this, but I think you guys were super early and a bunch of folks were early, which is like these agents will always be better at code than probably everything else. So if they're always better at code than everything else, then we should probably start to use that as an advantage in everything that we're doing agentically. And guess what? It like turns out that if you're really good at code, then you're probably also really good at tool use and using MCPs and writing code on the fly to perform some kind of action. So we should probably like take advantage of that. And this is like an imperfect analogy, but like to some extent, it's sort of like, what if every knowledge worker or domain in a business had like an unlimited supply of engineers sort of right next to them to do whatever they are trying to do now, essentially for free, turns out it's becoming like probably more expensive than people, but we thought it was free. So we need to figure that part out. So God bless Mythos for that problem. But basically, if you imagine like your social media manager or your performance marketer or your sales system analyst, if they had an engineer full-time next to them, what would they have them go do? Well, you'd probably be like, I'm going to wire up the most crazy automated marketing campaign integrated strategy. I'm going to get the best customer intelligence from all of my data systems and then be able to sort of surface them up to my sales rep. So what are those? Those are coding tasks that you could have, like, if we had expendable engineering resources previously, you could have put an engineer on that, and you just never would have because we don't have expendable coders in organizations. But now you do. And so the idea of take a code harness, make it really, really good now at non-coding tasks. I mean, they're coding, but they're not for engineers. They're for knowledge work. That kind of becomes an interesting primitive that sort of makes sense across all of knowledge work. And by the way, we're now seeing this with Codex as a super app. We're seeing this with Claude Cowork. And so I think until proven otherwise, I think as a harness, harnesses now make sense to be these expert coders. They should have a computer. They should have a sandbox. They can write code and run code in. They actually obviously need connectors to all the different systems that they're using. And then there's an overlay of like what makes them now not just coders. And that's like either the vertical or horizontal domain expertise. So in our world, we have, we spend a lot of time in our system prompt and the variety parts of the harness. We spend time making sure that our agent knows about file systems and like how do you peruse a file system and when should you use a search tool versus when should you navigate a folder path. And it's like a really interesting problem because if you just went to search every single time, then often search doesn't tell you the surrounding environment that something might be within. But clicking a couple folders deep, you all of a sudden get that information. And so you actually need to know like what is the type of task I'm being given and should I be doing a search to find the single document, or should I be going through a folder tree to find the sort of workspace that everything lives within? And so we spend a lot of time to make our agent really good at those types of things. And then obviously that needs to then show up in a vertical specific way because you can build a custom agent and so on. But I think everybody is going to have some form of that, but it will be basically built on the backbone of a coding harness.
As you guys think about building these agents, how do you think about model selection choice for what to use? And do you use multiple models in one agent run when I'm interacting with Box Agent? Will it call multiple under the hood?
We do with some asterisks. So I mean, there are some kind of penalties you get, like caching, and so it's like I think we're trying to figure out even what's our best version of hybrid on that. But I do think this is going to be this fun back and forth ping pong right now in the industry, which is which is on one hand, you could go to a harness that is sort of purpose-built for a model. And by definition, if it's purpose-built for a model, it's going to be, the model provider on the margin is going to be more oriented toward token maximization, token cost maximization, not even in any kind of like maybe explicit way as they build the harness. It's just sort of like they wouldn't maybe inherently care to make it efficient. Like it's just like that wouldn't be core to their business model. And obviously it's going to be wired up against effectively one model. And so for everybody who's not a frontier lab, you're probably doing things intentionally to be multi-model. And if you're multi-model, like what are the benefits? One, different capabilities from the models then become useful. So like one model is better at coding, another is better at legal contracts, another model is better at looking at an insurance claim document. Okay, once you have evals, you can kind of know that. So that gives you one advantage of being neutral is sort of capability differentiation. There's a performance differentiation because I can be like, okay, Gemini 3 Flash is faster than Opus 4.7. And so there are some things that you just want different types of workloads being applied against. And then there's finally cost. And cost might become the big story in the next 3 years. And so if cost becomes the really big story in the next 3 years, then what's going to happen is actually sending these tasks to the most general purpose system is going to basically average out your costs. Like that means like sometimes you'll do it in a performant way because it just happens to kind of align with that system, and sometimes you'll be spending way too much money for that task. And so I don't know when and how this happens, but like there's some threshold. Another graph you guys should publish. But
these are great ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, exactly.
Notes, yeah.
I don't know if they are. They'll probably be like your worst tweets. But there's some threshold where like the cost savings of the task become worth having a dedicated harness to, and we're all kind of figuring out where those points are, right? So if you were to go do an insurance claims process and you were going to go and like automate that as much as possible and either generate $50 million more per year or cost $50 million per year, but it's like it's either big upside or big cost, then probably there's some point in the threshold where it'd be better for you to be hyper-tuned to the right model, the right capability, the right custom instructions for that workload. And because that could net tens of millions of dollars of either more revenue or more cost savings. And so not every workflow has that. Me just chatting and trying to figure out like how do I summarize a document doesn't really have that component, but a really heavy duty workflow will. And so I think that will mean that over time, as basically you have like frontier intelligence that will always be expensive, and you can kind of peel off, just frontier -1 intelligence from like 3 months ago. Then all of a sudden, it starts to make sense to peel those kind of workloads probably to cheaper models where there's some kind of capability, maybe focus, and you then ultimately would want a harness that could kind of handle that level of sort of neutrality. And that I think will be an interesting trend to watch. What happens? What parts of an industry will that happen in, et cetera.
I think this is already happening over the past few months.
Yeah.
I think there was the Uber CTO who said they blew through all of their token budget. I want to say ServiceNow recently said something similar. I think you had a tweet on like token budgeting.
Yeah.
I think it's happening with coding agents first because I think adoption's first and foremost, but then once everyone starts adopting these frontier models, costs explode.
Right.
What do you think the end game for that is in coding in particular? Are you guys running into that at Box at all? Are you seeing this pretty commonly in enterprises?
Yeah, I mean, it was so funny because like there was like, I think the token maxing meme only lasted 3 days because it was like, first of all, only Facebook can actually afford to do that. And so it was like, I'm sure, there's probably some very well-funded startups here as well that can do it. But like for us mere mortal companies, we have to like have budgets and we have to like, have planning cycles and how much can we use. And so we have not yet run into like major existential issues on the coding side. We're still more in the ascent, like where we're just continuing to say, yeah, use it as much as you can, assuming it's productive. But like we're not like rewarding you for using lots of tokens because you just get weird kind of obviously like perverse incentives on that. So it's just like use it productively, and then we use our roadmap really as a means of pushing the envelope. So we want to stack more things into the roadmap, and that should actually control and drive the token utilization. But I do think that as this sort of translates into enterprises, and this is again another maybe just slight difference of if you're at a Silicon Valley, funded startup, like you can basically convert VC dollars into tokens in a way that, like, if you go to a Wall Street bank or a public company across, name your industry, they can't do that. They have like EPS targets they have to hit every single quarter. And so they can't all of a sudden spend $10 million more on an AI bill. And so once that pressure starts to build, all of a sudden you're going to have now okay, we have to do things more efficiently, which means we probably need a mixture of models, in these types of workflows. And that's just going to become, it'll have to become a bigger part of this conversation, even though we're seeing the early signs in coding right now.
We're wrapping up, but one last quick question. Can you give us a sneak preview of your next tweet? What's top of mind that we should know about?
Any ideas out there? What should we talk about? Anybody got anything? Okay. Don't collaborate on tweets with large audiences is a really important
Maybe
lesson
that
here.
can be the tweet itself.
Okay, exactly, yeah. We'll see how that one does. No, I mean, first of all, incredibly exciting time to be doing anything with AI right now. And I think we're all fortunate to be in these sort of builder positions, whether you're in a large organization or within the startup world. And ultimately, I think it's a moment of, like, how do we bridge this technology into organizations? So yeah, super excited to be in this moment, and congrats on all the awesome announcements from today. So yeah, great work.
I think we all are. Let's give it up for Aaron. Thank you.